On a November afternoon in 1963, the world changed in an instant. The shots that rang out in Dallas did not just claim the life of a president, they fractured a nation's trust and left questions that have haunted generations. For one teenager sitting in his high school physics class, that moment became more than a memory. It became a lifelong obsession. His name is Rob Reiner, and for 60 years he has chased the truth behind America's darkest political mystery. Now, after decades of silence, research, and relentless pursuit, he believes he finally knows who was truly responsible. The day that changed everything. The autumn of 1963 was supposed to be uneventful for 16-year-old Rob Reiner. He was an ordinary student in Los Angeles, far from the politics of Washington, when whispered words in a classroom brought his world to a halt. A messenger leaned into his teacher's ear, and then the announcement came. President John F. Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. Students were dismissed, but what awaited them at home was something no one was prepared for. On television, the black and white images showed chaos, grief, and a country stunned into silence. Reiner, like millions of Americans, sat glued to the unfolding tragedy. The days that followed only deepened the trauma. Just as the country began processing the idea of Lee Harvey Oswald as the accused assassin, another shocking scene unfolded live on television. Oswald himself was murdered, shot at point-blank range by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. For a teenager like Reiner, it was like watching history unravel into a nightmare. He later said that everyone who lived through that time can remember exactly where they were when they heard the news. The surreal sequence, Kennedy's assassination, Oswald's arrest, and Oswald's murder on live TV, etched itself permanently into his consciousness. For most, the story ended there. The Warren Commission would later conclude that Oswald acted alone and the country tried to move forward. But for Rob Reiner, the story was never over. What began as a teenager's shock grew into a man's relentless quest to understand what really happened in Dallas. That high school moment was not just a memory. It was the beginning of a 60-year journey that would eventually challenge the official version of history and lead him to name 4 men he believes orchestrated the killing of President John F. Kennedy, from witness to investigator. As the years passed, the images of that November day never left Rob Reiner's mind. While others accepted the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald was a lone gunman, Reiner grew increasingly uneasy. Too many details did not add up. Why had the man accused of killing the president been silenced before he could stand trial? Why did eyewitness accounts from Dealey Plaza differ so dramatically from the official story? And why did medical professionals who worked on President Kennedy describe wounds that looked more like entrance wounds than exits? These questions followed him into adulthood, refusing to fade with time. By the 1970s and 1980s, Reiner had established himself as a respected filmmaker. His work brought him critical acclaim and cultural influence, but behind the success, his fascination with the Kennedy assassination lingered. He began traveling repeatedly to Dealey Plaza in Dallas, retracing the path of the motorcade, standing where witnesses once stood, and studying the angles from which bullets could have been fired. For him, the plaza was not just a site of tragedy, it was a living classroom. He placed himself exactly where Abraham Zapruder had held his camera, imagining the horror that unfolded through that lens. Over time, Reiner began speaking to those who had been there, eyewitnesses, doctors, researchers, and forensic experts. He wanted to know what they had seen, what they remembered, and what the official investigations had ignored. What he found was a maze of contradictions. Doctors at Parkland Hospital described wounds consistent with shots from the front. Witnesses reported hearing gunfire from more than one direction. Yet these testimonies were often downplayed, omitted, or altered in the official record. Reiner's role shifted from that of an observer to that of an investigator. With his skills as a storyteller and the resources available to him, he began piecing together a broader picture, one that was far more complex than the lone gunman theory. His journey was no longer about curiosity. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried beneath decades of denial and deception. And as the pieces began to fall into place, he discovered a chilling reality. Kennedy's assassination was not the act of a single man, but the result of a coordinated conspiracy involving powerful forces, the conspiracy and the three factions. What Rob Reiner's decades of investigation uncovered was a conspiracy more complex and disturbing than the public had been led to believe. For 60 years, the official narrative insisted on a lone gunman firing from the Texas School Book Depository. But Reiner's research, supported by newly declassified documents, forensic studies, and eyewitness accounts, painted a different picture. The assassination was the result of an unholy alliance between three powerful groups: rogue elements within the CIA, radical members of the Cuban exile community, and high-ranking figures in organized crime. Each group had its own reasons for wanting John F. Kennedy out of the way. For the CIA, bitterness lingered after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Many within the agency believed Kennedy's refusal to provide air support doomed the operation, humiliating the United States and straining relations with the Cuban exile forces trained for the mission. His subsequent efforts to open dialogue with the Soviet Union and explore détente with Fidel Castro only deepened their perception of him as a liability. To them, Kennedy was weakening America's stance in the Cold War and threatening intelligence operations they had spent years constructing. The Cuban exile community, many of whom had been armed and trained by the CIA, felt personally betrayed. They had risked their lives in the hope of overthrowing Castro and reclaiming their homeland. When Kennedy signaled a withdrawal from aggressive intervention, those dreams collapsed. Among the most radical of them, vengeance against Kennedy became a sacred mission. They believed he had abandoned their cause, and some were willing to align with darker forces to strike back. Organized crime had its own bitter score to settle. Mafia leaders had once quietly supported Kennedy's presidential bid, expecting protection in return. Instead, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in American history. The mob felt double-crossed. Their operations, once protected, now faced relentless federal crackdowns. Eliminating Kennedy would serve both as revenge and as a way to end a presidency that threatened their survival. According to Reiner's findings, these three groups, on the surface unrelated, came together through shared interests. Their coordination was meticulous. Multiple shooters were positioned at different vantage points around Dealey Plaza. The result was a crossfire executed with military precision, ensuring confusion in the aftermath. This was not an impulsive act by one man, but a carefully planned political execution. And behind it all, Reiner concluded, were specific individuals who had the motive, the power, and the opportunity to change history forever. New evidence and revelations. For decades, those who questioned the official story were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. But Rob Reiner's deep investigation, combined with modern forensic science and declassified files, has brought new revelations that can no longer be ignored. Some of the most compelling evidence came from the very doctors who tried to save President Kennedy's life at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. In recent interviews and documentaries, these physicians spoke with chilling unanimity. The wounds they saw on Kennedy were consistent with entrance wounds, not exits. This directly contradicted the lone gunman theory, which relied on the idea that Oswald fired from behind. If all the wounds were entrance wounds, then the shots could not have come solely from the Texas School Book Depository. More startling was the testimony of a former CIA asset, discovered after decades of silence. This insider claimed that two notorious figures, Johnny Roselli, a mafia operative with ties to the CIA, and E. Howard Hunt, a high-ranking CIA officer, were transported to Dallas on November 22, 1963. Roselli had long been rumored to play a role in covert plots, while Hunt's career linked him to some of the darkest operations in U.S. history. According to this account, their presence in Dallas was no coincidence. Newly declassified documents support the logistics of their movements, aligning perfectly with independently verified events of that day. For Reiner, this testimony was the missing link that tied organized crime and the intelligence community directly to the assassination. Thousands of pages of CIA files released in recent years further dismantle the idea of Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone, disaffected drifter. Instead, they reveal years of contact between Oswald and intelligence operatives. Far from being an outsider, he appeared entangled in a web of espionage and covert operations long before the assassination. The files suggest that Oswald was at minimum a known asset, and at worst a scapegoat deliberately positioned to take the blame. Finally, forensic breakthroughs brought the past into sharper focus. Old photographs and film footage from Dealey Plaza were enhanced with modern digital technology, revealing details once invisible. Figures previously blurred into the background became identifiable. Ballistic analysis confirmed that shots came from multiple directions, creating the deadly crossfire that eyewitnesses had always described. Taken together, the medical testimony, CIA records, and forensic evidence built a case too powerful to dismiss. For Reiner, this was no longer speculation. It was proof that the assassination was the result of a coordinated conspiracy involving powerful men who had successfully hidden in the shadows for 60 years. The official cover-up and manipulation of truth. If the assassination itself was meticulously planned, the cover-up that followed was equally deliberate. Rob Reiner's investigation points to a coordinated effort to bury the truth within hours of the shooting. At Parkland Hospital, doctors who initially described Kennedy's wounds as entrance wounds later found themselves pressured to modify their statements. Critical evidence vanished, witness testimonies were edited or ignored, and the machinery of secrecy began operating at full force. The Warren Commission, created in 1964 to investigate Kennedy's death, was presented to the public as the ultimate authority. Its conclusion, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, became the official narrative taught for generations. But Reiner's research reveals how the commission was compromised from within. Key figures with ties to intelligence agencies controlled the flow of evidence, ensuring that anything pointing to a wider conspiracy never reached the final report. This was not a neutral investigation. It was, as Reiner describes, an instrument of deception. More than a decade later, the House Select Committee on Assassinations revisited the case. Their conclusion contradicted the Warren Commission, acknowledging that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. Yet even this investigation was compromised. According to Reiner, CIA-connected individuals once again acted as gatekeepers of critical information. Two official government inquiries had produced opposite conclusions, one claiming Oswald acted alone, the other admitting conspiracy, but both were tainted. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover also played a central role in shaping the narrative. Witnesses whose testimony contradicted the lone gunman theory were discredited or silenced. Reports were selectively written to align with the official story. By the time the public saw the final findings, a carefully curated version of events had been locked in place. The American people were told a story meant to soothe rather than reveal. The final revelation, and naming the four suspects. After 60 years of investigation, Rob Reiner reached the point where speculation gave way to certainty. In his 10-part podcast, Who Killed JFK, co-hosted with journalist Soledad O'Brien, he did what few before him dared. He named the men he believed orchestrated and carried out the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. For Reiner, it was the culmination of decades spent combing through Dealey Plaza, studying forensic reports, speaking with experts, and examining newly declassified documents. His conclusion identified 4 individuals tied directly to the 3 factions that had aligned against Kennedy. From the world of organized crime came Johnny Roselli, a Chicago mobster deeply embedded with the CIA through covert operations against Castro. His presence in Dallas, confirmed by testimony from a former CIA asset, placed him at the center of the conspiracy. Representing the intelligence community was E. Howard Hunt, a CIA officer later infamous for his role in the Watergate scandal. Hunt's reputation in black operations and his movements on November 22, 1963, aligned too perfectly with the assassination for Reiner to ignore. The Cuban exile community also played its part. Evidence pointed toward Herminio Diaz Garcia, a Cuban mercenary and exile operative with documented ties to both organized crime and intelligence operations. Diaz had been trained for anti-Castro missions and carried the skill set necessary for a high-level political hit. Finally, another figure within the Cuban exile network, Rolando Cubela, emerged as a critical suspect. Known by his CIA code name, AM/LASH, Cubela had been approached by the agency in discussions about assassinating Castro. His involvement in Dallas revealed the dark irony of operatives prepared to kill one leader being turned against their own president. Together, these 4 men represented the convergence of interests that had made Kennedy a target. They were not acting alone, but as part of a carefully orchestrated operation supported by networks of intelligence, exiles, and organized crime. The assassination was not random, not impulsive. It was a coup executed in broad daylight, hidden behind a false narrative for decades. For Rob Reiner, naming these men was not about sensationalism. It was about confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. The boy who once sat in a classroom hearing the news had spent a lifetime pursuing justice for a president and a nation robbed of both leadership and truth. And now, 6 decades later, he believed he had finally pulled back the curtain on the most haunting political crime in American history. For 60 years, the world was told a story of 1 man and 3 bullets. But Rob Reiner's investigation suggests it was never that simple. If he is right, history itself must be rewritten. Do you believe these 4 men were truly responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep stories like this one.